September 28, 1917, New York City. A financial instrument designed to raise an unprecedented $2 billion in just 30 days stood ready to be absorbed by American citizens through an entirely new kind of financial network. This colossal sum, equivalent to over $40 billion today, had been mobilized not through the slow, cautious hands of traditional Wall Street syndicates, but through a mass movement. The Second Liberty Loan had been assembled in just weeks. In traditional finance, master bankers had spent 6 to 8 months orchestrating complex bond issuances for railroads or major industries, targeting a handful of wealthy institutions and individuals. Deals of similar magnitude had been painstakingly cultivated since before the Panic of 1907. Yet here, a completely democratized financial pipeline stood ready for service. Over 10 million Americans stepped forward, not traditional investors or experienced brokers, but former factory workers, farmers, housewives, and clerks who had never purchased a bond in their lives. The crowd of officials, journalists, and competing financiers had gathered to witness a moment that would trigger a profound transformation in industrial-scale capital mobilization. A systematic revolution through American financial innovation that would echo across decades. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle strategies, but in production statistics and financial solvency that would shatter every assumption financial experts carried about capital-raising limits, timeframes, and industrial possibility. The transformation had begun on April 6, 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany. Suddenly, America needed to fund an expeditionary force, equip an army, and supply its allies on a scale never before imagined. The cost was staggering. Traditional financial institutions, centered on Wall Street, were ill-equipped for this challenge. Their methods were designed for a peacetime economy, built on exclusivity, long-term relationships, and careful risk assessment. When the government approached the established financial houses, they met with a cautious reception. J.P. Morgan and Company, the dominant investment bank of the era, could handle large deals, but their network focused on institutional clients and wealthy individuals. They thought in terms of months, even years, to raise the kind of money required. They couldn't simply turn on a faucet for billions. Yet, a solution began to form, not on the marble floors of Wall Street, but in the mind of Charles G. Dawes, a man who had built his career not as a high financer, but as a banker in the Midwest, a politician, and a general. He had served as comptroller of the currency and would later become Vice President of the United States. He was an outsider to the inner sanctums of New York finance. Dawes, along with Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo, had just promised President Woodrow Wilson that they would fund America's entry into the Great War. Traditional financiers dismissed their timelines as impossible. The established bond houses, accustomed to their carefully cultivated networks, reluctantly agreed to advise, assuming their expertise would compensate for Dawes's lack of proper Wall Street experience. What none of them understood was that Dawes's lack of traditional high finance experience would become his greatest advantage. Among those watching was Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co., who had designed more complex financial deals than Dawes had probably seen. The journey from skepticism to revolution began not in the exclusive boardrooms of Manhattan, but in the wartime necessity of Washington, D.C. As Dawes and McAdoo examined traditional financial procedures in early 1917, they recognized immediately that conventional methods would never meet wartime demands. Dawes, having observed political campaigns and mass movements, realized that the public itself could be mobilized. He saw finance not as an exclusive club, but as a national effort. The traditional financiers considered this comparison absurd. Loans were for banks, bonds for institutions. But Dawes proposed something audacious: to eliminate reliance on just the wealthy elite entirely. Traditional capital raising relied on private placements and syndicates, carefully approaching a few hundred or thousand potential buyers. Each major bond issuance required perhaps hundreds of personalized appeals. Dawes proposed using mass marketing and national patriotism instead. He had mastered public appeals in his political career. Treasury Secretary McAdoo, an even more fervent proponent, became the public face of this new strategy, directly appealing to every American. Wall Street examined Dawes and McAdoo's proposal with deep skepticism. Their private correspondence, preserved in national archives, revealed the financial establishment's reaction. Government bonds have never been proven reliable for mass public consumption at this scale. This is an unproven concept. They are proposing we bet America's solvency on an unproven approach. Yet the leaders also recognized desperation. The war in Europe was consuming staggering amounts of capital. Britain and France were running out of money, relying on American loans. If America couldn't fund itself quickly, the entire Allied war effort would collapse. In 1917 alone, the U.S. government needed to raise billions, more than the entire federal budget of just a few years prior. American finance, using conventional methods, would require an average of 6 to 8 months to float a significant loan. At that pace, the Allies would lose the war before American industry could respond. The decision to approve Dawes and McDowell's mass bond sales represented not confidence, but necessity. The infrastructure for this financial revolution rose from empty rhetoric between April and October 1917. Dawes and McDowell's organizational crews, experienced in political campaigns and public administration, erected a system that horrified traditional financiers. Instead of the massive investment banks and exclusive trading floors that characterized established finance, this new system featured something entirely different. The yard was laid out like a national public campaign. Open areas for public appeals surrounded thousands of local committees. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the nation, designed to move, not steal, but patriotism and financial pledges. Millions of brochures and posters stood ready. John Riley, chief financial analyst for one of New York's oldest banks and a 30-year veteran of bond markets, visited a Liberty Loan Committee meeting in May 1917. His inspection report, marked confidential at the time, contained technical criticism and grudging admiration. They have violated every principle of efficient capital raising I learned in 3 decades of experience. Their public appeal areas are too broad. Their volunteer capacity is absurdly excessive. Their sales targets are too ambitious. Yet, I must admit, the facility is designed for exactly what they claim: rapid assembly of public capital. The arrival of workers provided the next phase of revolutionary change. Traditional finance recruited from established moneyed communities, where skills passed from father to son across generations. Dawes and McAdoo advertised in newspapers across America, appealing to patriotism and promising that anyone could contribute. The first groups of salespeople arrived in communities across the nation in August 1917. The simplification of complex financial transactions into repeated, simple operations borrowed directly from mass marketing proved devastatingly effective. By October 1917, the Liberty Loan campaigns employed over 100,000 volunteers across the nation, with fewer than 200 having any previous Wall Street experience. Traditional bondbrokers spent 4 years as apprentices learning comprehensive skills. Dawes instructors taught specific techniques for specific tasks in approximately 2 weeks. Volunteers didn't need to know how to analyze credit ratings or market fluctuations, only how to explain the concept of a bond, collect small amounts of money, and record a pledge, which they would do repeatedly. As these financial agents gained experience through late 1917 and early 1918, something unexpected occurred. The time required to raise multi-billion-dollar sums began falling dramatically. America's first Liberty loan took 30 days to raise its $2 billion. Loan number 2 required 30 days for $3.8 billion. Loan number 3 required 25 days for $4.1 billion. Loan number 4 required 20 days for $6.9 billion. By spring 1918, the campaigns were mobilizing billions in weeks on average. Traditional financiers watched with growing alarm as this untrained workforce achieved capital mobilization speeds that matched and soon surpassed their own highly skilled syndicates. The mass appeal approach that traditional bankers had dismissed proved its power. Instead of carefully cultivating a few large investors, these campaigns simultaneously cultivated millions of small ones across the country. While one volunteer signed up factory workers, other committees appealed to farmers, school children, and civic organizations in parallel. When pledges were complete, the collective sum amounted to unprecedented billions. Albert Wooding, a production supervisor at the Treasury Department, explained the efficiency in a 1918 interview. In traditional finance, you cannot fund the entire project until the main investors are secured. You cannot secure the investors until the terms are negotiated. Everything happens in sequence. Dawes' approach allowed parallel production. While one team finalized the bond terms, another team built a nationwide sales network. When both were ready, the completed bond issue was dropped into the completed public market. Tasks that previously required weeks now took hours. The statistics of parallel financing revealed efficiency that seemed impossible to traditional financiers. A conventional syndicate might have 50 bankers attempting to place a large bond over 3 weeks, working in the cramped confines of a partially complete deal room. Dawes' approach signed hundreds of thousands of volunteers to assemble the complete capital, then used mass appeal to position the entire offering in a single 3-week operation. More disturbing still to traditional financial authorities was the casual elimination of centuries-old investment practices. Bond issues had always been built from carefully drafted prospectuses that specified every detail. Dawes used simplified terms that provided basic information and left details to public trust and patriotism. Traditional financiers considered this recklessness. Dawes called it flexibility. Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve initially fought against Dawes' simplified specifications. Bonds are not trinkets. Financial instruments require precision. But by June 1918, the Liberty loan campaigns were outproducing traditional contractors by 70%. He learned that perfection is the enemy of sufficient. These bonds were not complex, they were adequate, and adequate bonds delivered more capital than perfect bonds still awaiting negotiation. The lessons learned in WW1 were foundational, but it was in World War II that this impossible trick reached its zenith, driven by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. November 1942 brought the ultimate demonstration. Morgenthau, inspecting the nascent war bond drives, made an offhand comment to journalists that was overheard by his campaign director. He remarked that bond sales had improved remarkably, but noted that the recent fundraising still paled compared to what mass production had achieved in other industries. The director took the comment as a challenge. He proposed to Morgenthau that the Treasury would attempt to raise billions in weeks, cutting previous records in half, using every imaginable public channel. Morgenthau, skeptical but intrigued, authorized the attempt on condition it not disrupt regular financial markets. The campaign selected was the largest yet. Starting Sunday, November 8th at 1 minute past midnight, millions of Americans operating in carefully coordinated local drives would attempt something unprecedented in financial history. The mass marketing strategy reached its ultimate expression during the war bond drives. Every major appeal had been designed, vetted, and staged before the first radio announcement. Celebrities endorsed them. School children bought stamps that would accumulate into a bond. Local community groups organized tirelessly. Where conventional finance cultivated a few large institutions over months, Morgenthau's Treasury assembled billions from pre-qualified citizens in days. 4 days into the third war loan drive in September 1943, $2.5 billion had been raised. By day 12, it was $10 billion. On Thursday, September 30th, just 21 days after launching, the drive closed with an astonishing $18.9 billion raised, shattering its $15 billion goal. The crowd of observers included financial officials, military officers, competing financial house owners, and journalists from across America. Many arrived expecting to witness either failure or a compromised financial instrument that looked complete but lacked depth. What they saw instead was a fully operational capital mobilization engine. Morgenthau, present for the closing figures, made brief remarks that were recorded by newsreel cameras. His words captured the financial establishment's forced recognition that everything had changed. 6 months ago, I would have called this impossible. Traditional financial wisdom accumulated over centuries said you cannot raise billions from ordinary people in weeks. Henry Morgenthau and the American public have made traditional wisdom obsolete. The United States Treasury will now require all future government financing to adopt these methods. The psychological impact on traditional financiers was profound and immediate. The same firms that had dismissed such mass appeals as naive just 18 months earlier now sent analysts to study their approaches. The president of one of America's oldest and most prestigious banks visited a war bond committee meeting in December 1943. His confidential report to his board of directors revealed complete ideological collapse regarding traditional approaches. They have achieved what our industry considered impossible by refusing to accept our limitations. They treated capital raising as a marketing problem rather than a craft tradition. They simplified where we sought perfection. They standardized where we customized. They trained masses of unskilled salespeople where we cultivated generational expertise. The result is billions mobilized in a fraction of the time at a fraction of the cost. By early 1943, the influence of these approaches had transformed American finance. 8 war loan drives collectively raised over $185 billion from the American public, over $3.5 trillion in today's money. This scale of production was staggering to contemporary observers and remains impressive by modern standards. But perhaps the most devastating challenge to traditional financial authority came from the quality of the workforce. The tens of millions of ordinary citizens who had funded these wars represented a direct refutation of the old guild system that had dominated finance for centuries. The democratization of capital raising carried implications far beyond wartime production. By proving that complex financial mobilization could be performed by trained, motivated citizens rather than requiring generational financial expertise, these campaigns challenged fundamental assumptions about capital, skill, and economic organization. The prefabrication techniques, standardized bonds, welding procedures, mass marketing, and parallel assembly approaches, nationwide volunteer networks, pioneered during the war, became standard practice in global finance. When Japan and Germany rebuilt their economies in the 1950s and 1960s, they studied the war bond program and adopted its approaches as the foundation of their public finance. The massive capital markets that would dominate world finance for decades were direct descendants of these revolutionary practices. John Bunker, professor of financial history at a major university, summarized its lasting influence in his definitive study published in 1972. Dawes and Morgenthau entered wartime finance as outsiders, ignorant of Wall Street tradition, unconstrained by conventional wisdom, and willing to apply marketing principles that the established industry considered inappropriate for capital formation. In a few short years, they mobilized more capital than had been raised in America during the entire previous century. More importantly, they fundamentally altered how governments and industries would raise money worldwide for the remainder of the 20th century. The magnitude of this achievement can be measured in statistics that reveal both the scale of the program and its remarkable success. Production statistics show over $185 billion raised across 8 war loan drives between 1942 and 1945, from over 85 million individual purchases. The psychological transformation that the Liberty and War Bond programs created among financial managers and policymakers proved as significant as the physical capital produced. Before Dawes and Morgenthau, financial executives accepted conventional wisdom about capital limits, skill requirements, and organizational structures. These campaigns demonstrated that conventional wisdom could be wrong, and that breakthrough performance required questioning fundamental assumptions. The war bond story ultimately stands as a testament to a profound truth about human capability and financial possibility. The money itself, while crucial to Allied victory, mattered less than what its mobilization proved. Ordinary people, given training and opportunity, could achieve extraordinary financial results. Complex capital formation, previously requiring years of craft tradition, could be accomplished in weeks using systematized processes. Industries resistant to change for centuries could be revolutionized in months when necessity and innovation combined. In the end, this impossible trick was not about a single civilian's genius, but about their willingness to see finance not as a sacred craft, but as a solvable, adaptable problem. The financial establishment that dismissed these outsiders as naive spent decades after 1945 studying and implementing their techniques. The millions of ordinary citizens who learned to invest and contribute carried those skills and that confidence into peacetime careers that rebuilt America's post-war economy. The approaches pioneered under wartime emergency became peacetime standards that influenced financial markets across industries and around the world. The story of how one civilian's approach made billions in capital appear in days instead of months is ultimately a story of transformation through demonstration. It proves that the greatest revolutions often come from those unconstrained by tradition, that progress requires questioning accepted limits, and that human potential exceeds conventional expectations when properly organized and challenged. These financial pioneers were not superior humans. They were ordinary people achieving extraordinary results because someone believed they could and organized systems that allowed them to prove it. That lesson, demonstrated in the financial campaigns of WW1 and WW2 and validated by over $200 billion in mobilized capital, remains relevant wherever industries face challenges that conventional wisdom claims impossible. The physical bonds are mostly gone now, redeemed decades ago or resting in family archives. But the revolution they represented endures in every modern stock exchange, in every crowdfunding platform that uses mass appeal, in every financial literacy program that teaches specific skills quickly rather than broad expertise slowly, and in every manager who questions whether impossible truly means impossible or simply means nobody has figured out how yet. That is the enduring legacy, carved not in steel, but in a transformed understanding of what dedicated people can accomplish when freed from the constraints of tradition and challenged to attempt what experts claim cannot be done. From April 1917, when the first calls for war funding went out, knowing nothing about mass capital mobilization, to September 1943, when the third war loan shattered records, to September 1945, when the last war bond was delivered. These civilian-led efforts proved that financial revolutions happen not through incremental improvements, but through a fundamental reimagining of what is possible. The billions in capital raised between 1917 and 1945 carried more than economic power. They carried proof that human ingenuity, when unshackled from tradition and empowered by necessity, can accomplish the seemingly impossible.